The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte skipped down the grand hallway, her small footsteps echoing in the silence. At 8 years old, she possessed the same spirited nature that had once defined her late grandmother, Princess Diana, though she carried herself with the poise expected of a future member of the royal family. Her golden hair bounced with each step as she made her way toward the breakfast room, completely unaware that her name had become the center of a heated discussion that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. In the private study 3 floors above, Prince William sat rigid in his leather chair, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he stared at the official document before him. The paper, bearing the royal seal and Camilla's elegant signature, seemed to mock him with its formality. His hands trembled slightly as he read the same line for the 5th time, the words burning into his mind like a brand. Princess Charlotte's name had been deliberately and systematically removed from the official guest list for the upcoming state dinner honoring the visiting Danish royalty. The significance of this omission was not lost on William. State dinners were more than mere social gatherings, they were carefully orchestrated displays of royal hierarchy, diplomatic importance, and family unity. Every name on that list had been chosen with precision, every absence noted and analyzed by courtiers, diplomats, and the ever-watchful media. To exclude Charlotte was not simply an oversight or a scheduling conflict, it was a deliberate statement about her place within the family structure. William's mind raced back to the conversation he had overheard just 2 weeks prior. He had been walking past Camilla's private sitting room when he heard her voice, low and urgent, speaking to someone on the telephone. The words had seemed innocuous at the time, something about adjusting the arrangements and ensuring proper protocol. Now, those seemingly innocent phrases took on a sinister meaning that made his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and protective instinct. The relationship between William and his stepmother had always been complex, layered with years of unspoken resentment and carefully maintained civility. Unlike his brother Harry, who had openly expressed his feelings about Camilla's role in their parents' marriage, William had chosen the path of diplomatic silence. He understood the political necessity of accepting Camilla as part of their lives, especially after their father's ascension to the throne. But acceptance and trust were 2 entirely different things, and moments like this reminded him why that distinction mattered. Charlotte represented everything pure and innocent about the future of the monarchy. She was beloved by the public, her natural charm and intelligence shining through in every public appearance. The media adored her, often comparing her spirited personality to that of Diana, while noting her remarkable poise for such a young child. More importantly, she was William's daughter, his precious little girl who still believed in fairy tales and thought her grandfather was the most important person in the world simply because he wore a crown. The study door opened without a knock, and Catherine entered with her usual grace, though William immediately noticed the tension in her shoulders and the tight line of her mouth. She had clearly seen the document as well, and her reaction was written across her face in subtle signs that only a husband of over a decade would recognize. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the way she pressed her lips together, the measured pace of her steps, all indicators that the future queen consort was struggling to maintain her composure. "Have you spoken to your father about this?" Catherine asked, her voice carefully modulated but carrying an undertone of steel that William recognized as her protective maternal instinct kicking into high gear. She moved to stand beside his chair, her hand coming to rest on his shoulder in a gesture of both comfort and solidarity. William shook his head, still staring at the offending document. "I wanted to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before I confront him. This isn't just about Charlotte missing a dinner party, Catherine. This is about something much deeper, much more calculated." The implications were staggering when viewed through the lens of royal protocol and public perception. Charlotte's absence from such a significant event would be noticed immediately by the press, who had grown accustomed to seeing the young princess at family gatherings. Speculation would run rampant, with royal correspondents and gossip columnists crafting theories about family rifts, protocol disputes, and hidden tensions within the House of Windsor. But, beyond the public relations nightmare, William saw something more personal and more painful. He saw his daughter being systematically marginalized by someone who had never fully accepted her place in the family hierarchy. Camilla's actions suggested a woman who viewed the younger generation not as beloved family members, but as potential threats to her own position and influence within the royal structure. The historical precedent for such behavior was not lost on William. Royal history was littered with stories of stepmothers and stepchildren locked in battles for influence and recognition. But this was the 21st century, and Charlotte was an 8-year-old child who deserved protection from such political maneuvering. She deserved to grow up feeling secure in her place within the family, not wondering why she was suddenly excluded from important events without explanation. Catherine moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the morning light as she gazed out at the palace gardens where Charlotte and her brothers often played. "She's been asking about the dinner," Catherine said quietly. "She's excited about wearing the dress we picked out together, the blue one with the small diamonds that make her feel like Elsa from Frozen." "How do I tell her that she's no longer invited?" The pain in his wife's voice hit William like a physical blow. Catherine had always been fiercely protective of their children's emotional well-being, working tirelessly to give them as normal a childhood as possible despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. She had navigated the delicate balance between preparing them for their royal duties and preserving their innocence with remarkable skill and dedication. William stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo his inner turmoil. He began pacing the length of the study, his mind working through the various scenarios and potential consequences of different courses of action. He could confront Camilla directly, but that would likely result in a heated argument that could spiral into a family crisis. He could speak to his father, but Charles had always been protective of Camilla and might view any criticism of her actions as a personal attack. The telephone on his desk rang with the distinctive tone reserved for internal palace communications. William glanced at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly before he picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end belonged to Sir Edward Thompson, the private secretary who had served the family for over 2 decades and whose discretion was absolute. "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward's cultured voice was carefully neutral, but William detected an underlying note of concern. "I felt it necessary to inform you that Her Majesty Queen Camilla has made additional modifications to the state dinner arrangements. Perhaps we might discuss these changes at your earliest convenience?" The formal language was code, William knew. Sir Edward was telling him that there were more problems, more deliberate slights that needed to be addressed before they became public knowledge. The realization that Charlotte's exclusion might be just the beginning of a larger campaign made William's anger crystallize into something colder and more determined. "I'll be down in 10 minutes, William replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He replaced the receiver and turned to Catherine, who was watching him with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "Whatever else has happened, we'll deal with it together," she said, moving to stand beside him. "But Charlotte comes first. Her feelings, her security within this family, that's what matters most." William nodded, feeling grateful for the millionth time that he had chosen a wife who understood both the public demands of their role and the private needs of their children. Catherine's unwavering support gave him the strength to face whatever revelations awaited him in Sir Edward's office. As they prepared to leave the study, William took one last look at the document that had started this crisis. The official letterhead, the formal language, the careful legal phrasing, all of it designed to make Camilla's actions appear reasonable and proper. But, beneath the veneer of protocol, William saw the truth. This was a deliberate attempt to diminish his daughter's status within the family, and he would not allow it to continue unchallenged. The walk to Sir Edward's office felt longer than usual, each step taking them deeper into a confrontation that would test the very bonds that held the royal family together. William's protective instincts, honed by years of watching his own mother navigate the treacherous waters of royal politics, were fully engaged now. Charlotte might be too young to understand the nuances of what was happening, but he would ensure that she never had to question her place in the family or her father's love and protection. The palace corridors, usually a source of comfort and familiarity, now seemed to whisper with secrets and hidden agendas. Every portrait of past monarchs seemed to watch with knowing eyes, as if they understood that another chapter in the long history of royal family drama was about to unfold. But, this time, it involved an innocent child, and William was prepared to fight with every resource at his disposal to protect her from becoming a casualty in someone else's political game. Sir Edward Thompson's office was a study in understated elegance, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes chronicling centuries of royal protocol and precedent. The elderly private secretary stood as William and Catherine entered, his silver hair impeccably styled despite the early hour, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes betraying the weight of the information he was about to share. The morning light filtering through the tall windows cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the grave lines that had deepened considerably over the past few weeks. "Your Royal Highnesses," Sir Edward began, gesturing toward the pair of Chippendale chairs positioned before his mahogany desk. "I'm afraid the situation regarding Princess Charlotte's removal from the state dinner guest list is more complex than initially apparent." William felt Catherine's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on his arm as they settled into their seats. The formal atmosphere of the office, usually comforting in its adherence to tradition and order, now felt oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in around them. Sir Edward's measured tone and diplomatic language could not disguise the fact that they were about to learn something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the current crisis. Her Majesty Queen Camilla has also requested modifications to the seating arrangements for the upcoming Commonwealth reception, Sir Edward continued, consulting a leather portfolio filled with official documents and correspondence. Princess Charlotte's name has been removed from that guest list as well, along with several other events scheduled for the coming months. The revelation hit William like a physical blow. This was not an isolated incident or a simple scheduling conflict. This was a systematic campaign to exclude his daughter from the very events that would help establish her place within the royal hierarchy and prepare her for her future role. The Commonwealth reception was particularly significant, as it would introduce Charlotte to heads of state and government from across the realm, connections that would prove invaluable as she matured into her royal responsibilities. Catherine's voice was steady but cold when she spoke. What reason was given for these exclusions? Sir Edward's discomfort was evident as he shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the desk in an uncharacteristic display of nervousness. The official explanation cites concerns about Princess Charlotte's age and the appropriateness of exposing her to such formal diplomatic environments. However, I must note that similar concerns were not raised when Prince George attended comparable events at the same age. The double standard was glaring and impossible to ignore. George, as the future heir, had been carefully introduced to royal duties and diplomatic functions from an early age, with palace officials praising his composure and natural ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Charlotte, despite displaying the same natural charm and intelligence, was apparently being held to an entirely different set of standards. William's mind raced through the implications of this pattern. It wasn't just about missing a few social events, it was about deliberately limiting Charlotte's exposure to the experiences that would shape her understanding of her role within the monarchy. Every royal child needed to develop relationships with diplomats, understand the nuances of international protocol, and learn to represent the crown with dignity and grace. By excluding her from these formative experiences, Camilla was effectively handicapping Charlotte's preparation for her future responsibilities. "There's more, isn't there?" William asked, reading the continued tension in Sir Edward's posture. The private secretary nodded reluctantly. Her Majesty has also submitted a proposal to restructure the children's education schedule. She's suggesting that Princess Charlotte might benefit from a more domestic focus in her studies, with reduced emphasis on languages, international relations, and constitutional law. Catherine stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the Persian carpet as she began to pace the length of the office. Her usually serene demeanor had given way to barely controlled outrage, and William could see the protective mother emerging from beneath the polished exterior of the future queen consort. The suggestion that Charlotte's education should be limited was not just insulting, it was potentially damaging to her intellectual development and future effectiveness as a working royal. "She's 8 years old," Catherine said, her voice tight with emotion. "She speaks 3 languages fluently, shows exceptional aptitude for mathematics and science, and has expressed genuine interest in learning about the Commonwealth nations. Now we're supposed to believe that she should focus on domestic skills instead?" The gendered implications of Camilla's suggestions were impossible to ignore. While George was being groomed for leadership with intensive tutoring in governance, diplomacy, and statecraft, Charlotte was apparently expected to conform to a more traditional feminine role that emphasized social graces over intellectual achievement. It was a backwards approach that ignored both Charlotte's obvious capabilities and the modern expectations of female royals. Sir Edward cleared his throat delicately. "I should also mention that several members of the household staff have reported unusual instructions regarding Princess Charlotte's participation in family photographs and public appearances." William felt his anger reach a new level of intensity. "What kind of instructions?" "Specific requests that she be positioned in less prominent locations during photo sessions, suggestions that her public appearances be limited to what Her Majesty terms appropriate occasions, and recommendations that she be accompanied by adult supervision at all times, even for routine activities within the palace grounds." The picture that was emerging was one of systematic marginalization disguised as protective concern. Every suggestion, every modification, every restriction was designed to minimize Charlotte's visibility and importance within the family structure. It was a subtle but comprehensive campaign that would effectively relegate her to a secondary role, regardless of her position in the line of succession or her natural abilities. Catherine stopped pacing and turned to face both men, her eyes blazing with maternal fury. This isn't about protocol or appropriateness. This is about jealousy and insecurity. Camilla sees Charlotte as a threat to her own position and influence, so she's trying to diminish her before she's old enough to defend herself. The accusation hung in the air like an explosive device, its implications reverberating through the formal atmosphere of the office. Sir Edward looked distinctly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he could retreat from this conversation entirely, but his duty to the family required him to provide them with all relevant information, regardless of how politically sensitive it might be. William stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the palace gardens where Charlotte often played with her brothers. The sight of the swing set that he and Catherine had installed, despite objections from certain palace officials who thought it inappropriate for such formal grounds, reminded him of his commitment to giving his children as normal a childhood as possible. The innocence of that playground equipment stood in stark contrast to the political machinations being discussed in Sir Edward's office. "What's my father's position on all of this?" William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sir Edward consulted his notes again, clearly choosing his words with extreme care. His Majesty has expressed confidence in Her Majesty's judgment regarding family matters and has indicated that he considers these decisions to be within her purview as Queen Consort. The response was predictable but, nonetheless, disappointing. Charles had always been protective of Camilla, perhaps out of guilt over the circumstances of their relationship's beginning, or maybe from genuine love and respect for her judgment. But this blind support was allowing real harm to be done to Charlotte, and William found himself questioning his father's priorities as both a king and a grandfather. Catherine returned to her seat, her composure gradually returning as she processed the full scope of what they were dealing with. "We need to understand the endgame here. If Camilla is systematically working to marginalize Charlotte now, what happens as she gets older? What happens when she's ready for more significant royal duties?" It was a chilling question that opened up possibilities neither parent wanted to consider. If these restrictions and limitations continued as Charlotte matured, she could find herself completely sidelined from meaningful royal work, relegated to ceremonial appearances and charitable patronages while the real power and influence remained concentrated in other hands. It would be a waste of her obvious talents and a disservice to the monarchy itself. Sir Edward closed his portfolio with a soft thud that seemed to emphasize the finality of the situation they faced. "I should mention that these modifications have not yet been implemented in full. There is still time to address the situation before it becomes irreversible, but action would need to be taken quickly to prevent lasting damage to Princess Charlotte's position within the family structure." The implication was clear: they had a narrow window of opportunity to fight back before Camilla's campaign became entrenched policy. But any action they took would necessarily involve confronting not just Camilla, but potentially Charles himself, risking a family rift that could have far-reaching consequences for the monarchy's stability and public image. William turned from the window, his decision crystallizing as he looked at his wife's determined expression and Sir Edward's expectant face. "Schedule a private meeting with my father for this afternoon. I want to discuss this situation directly, without intermediaries or diplomatic language." "Your Royal Highness," Sir Edward said carefully, "might I suggest approaching this matter with considerable delicacy? The relationships involved are complex, and the potential for misunderstanding is significant." Catherine's laugh was devoid of humor. "I think we're past the point of delicacy, Sir Edward. When someone is systematically targeting your child, diplomacy becomes a luxury you can't afford." The truth of her words resonated through the office, highlighting the fundamental conflict between their roles as parents and their responsibilities as members of the royal family. In any normal family, protecting a child from such treatment would be straightforward, but the complex dynamics of royal life meant that every action carried political implications that extended far beyond their personal situation. William moved toward the door, his mind already focused on the confrontation that lay ahead. "Arrange the meeting, Sir Edward. And prepare a comprehensive file documenting all of these changes and restrictions. I want everything in writing before I speak to my father." As they prepared to leave the office, Sir Edward stood and straightened his tie, a gesture that somehow conveyed both his professional dedication and his personal concern for the family he had served so faithfully. "Your Royal Highnesses, if I may offer a personal observation after decades of service to this family, Princess Charlotte is a remarkable child with extraordinary potential. It would be a tragedy if that potential were diminished by political considerations or personal animosities. The private secretary's words carried the weight of his experience and the wisdom of someone who had watched multiple generations of royals navigate the treacherous waters of family dynamics and public expectations. His support, subtle as it was, gave William additional confidence that they were fighting not just for Charlotte's immediate well-being, but for the long-term health of the monarchy itself. Walking back through the palace corridors, William felt the weight of impending confrontation settling on his shoulders like a mantle. The conversation with his father would likely be one of the most difficult of his life, forcing him to choose between family harmony and his daughter's future. But, as he thought of Charlotte's bright smile and boundless curiosity, he knew there was really no choice at all. The king's private study at Clarence House had always intimidated William, even as an adult. The room carried the weight of centuries of royal authority, its walls adorned with portraits of monarchs stretching back through generations of British history. Charles sat behind an imposing desk crafted from timber salvaged from HMS Victory, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed a stack of government papers that required his attention. The afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, creating an atmosphere that was both majestic and, somehow, foreboding. William entered the room with measured steps, carrying the leather portfolio that Sir Edward had prepared containing documentation of every slight, every exclusion, every systematic attempt to marginalize Charlotte. The weight of the folder seemed disproportionate to its actual contents, heavy with implications and potential consequences that could reshape family relationships for years to come. His father looked up as he approached, setting aside his reading glasses with a gesture that conveyed both welcome and wariness. "William," Charles said, his voice carrying the formal tone that had become more pronounced since his coronation. "Sir Edward mentioned you wanted to discuss some family matters. Please, sit down." The invitation was cordial but carried undertones that suggested the king already suspected the nature of this conversation. Charles had always been perceptive about family dynamics, perhaps as a result of his own challenging childhood and the complex relationships that had defined his path to the throne. He gestured toward the leather chair positioned across from his desk, the same chair where William had sat for countless conversations throughout his life, though none as potentially explosive as this one. William settled into the familiar seat, placing the portfolio on his lap but not opening it immediately. He had rehearsed this conversation multiple times during the drive from Kensington Palace, considering various approaches and anticipating potential responses. But now, facing his father across the expanse of polished wood and accumulated history, he found himself struggling to find the right words to begin such a delicate but crucial discussion. "Father, I need to speak with you about Charlotte," William began, his voice steady despite the churning emotions beneath the surface. "About decisions that are being made regarding her participation in family events and her future role within the monarchy." Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming carefully neutral in a way that immediately put William on guard. It was the same expression his father had worn during countless difficult conversations throughout William's life, a mask of diplomatic composure that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. The king's fingers drummed silently against the leather arm of his chair, a nervous habit that betrayed the calm exterior he was working to maintain. "I assume this concerns the recent adjustments to the state dinner arrangements," Charles said carefully. "Camilla explained her reasoning to me, and I found her concerns to be quite reasonable. Charlotte is still very young, and some of these formal occasions can be overwhelming for children." The response was exactly what William had expected, but it still stung with its casual dismissal of his daughter's capabilities and readiness for royal responsibilities. He opened the portfolio and withdrew the first document, placing it on the desk between them. The official letterhead and formal language seemed to mock the intimate nature of their conversation, reducing family relationships to bureaucratic procedures and protocol modifications. "This isn't just about one dinner, Father," William said, his voice beginning to carry an edge of frustration. "Charlotte has been systematically removed from multiple events, her education schedule is being restructured to limit her academic development, and there are suggestions that her public appearances should be restricted. This is a pattern, not a one-time scheduling decision." Charles picked up the document and read it carefully, his expression revealing nothing as he absorbed the formal language and specific modifications. William watched his father's face for any sign of surprise or concern, but the king's years of diplomatic training made him virtually unreadable. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the gentle ticking of an antique clock that had witnessed countless royal family conversations over the decades. "These decisions were made with Charlotte's best interests in mind," Charles finally said, setting the document aside without really addressing the substance of William's concerns. "Camilla has considerable experience with protocol matters, and her judgment in these areas has proven quite sound. perhaps you're reading more into this than is actually there." The dismissal was gentle but unmistakable, and William felt his carefully controlled anger beginning to rise toward the surface. His father was essentially asking him to ignore clear evidence of systematic marginalization in favor of trusting Camilla's judgment, despite the obvious conflicts of interest involved. It was a request that prioritized family harmony over his daughter's welfare, and William found himself unwilling to make that compromise. "Father, with respect, Charlotte is my daughter," William said, his voice growing firmer. "She's a bright, capable child who has shown remarkable aptitude for her future responsibilities. These restrictions aren't protecting her, they're limiting her potential and sending a message about her value within our family structure." Charles stood abruptly and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens where Charlotte had played during recent family visits. His posture suggested internal conflict, as if he was wrestling with competing loyalties and responsibilities. When he turned back to face William, his expression had softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the grandfather who genuinely loved all his grandchildren but struggled with the complex dynamics of his new marriage. "William, you must understand my position," Charles said, his voice carrying a note of pleading that was rarely heard from the usually composed monarch. "Camilla has sacrificed a great deal to support my role as king. She has faced unprecedented criticism and scrutiny, much of it unfair and personally devastating. Her judgment on family matters has always been sound, and questioning her decisions now would undermine her authority and our marriage." The admission revealed the crux of the problem. Charles was so invested in protecting and supporting Camilla that he was unable to objectively evaluate her actions regarding Charlotte. His gratitude and loyalty to his wife, while admirable in some respects, was blinding him to the potential harm being done to his granddaughter. It was a painful realization that highlighted the impossible position Charles found himself in as both husband and grandfather. William stood and approached his father, the portfolio still in his hands but his focus entirely on the man who had shaped so much of his understanding of duty and responsibility. "Father, I'm not questioning Camilla's sacrifices or her commitment to supporting you. But I cannot stand by and watch my daughter be marginalized because of adult political considerations that she's too young to understand or defend herself against." The conversation was approaching a crisis point, and both men seemed to recognize the potential for lasting damage to their relationship. Charles had always prided himself on his ability to balance competing interests and find diplomatic solutions to family conflicts, but this situation offered no easy compromise. Either Charlotte's interests would be protected, or Camilla's authority would be supported, but finding a solution that satisfied both objectives seemed increasingly impossible. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Charles asked, his voice carrying a note of resignation that suggested he already knew the answer would be unacceptable to one party or another. William placed another document on the desk, this one outlining a comprehensive plan for Charlotte's continued participation in royal events and her educational development. "I'm asking you to reverse these restrictions and ensure that Charlotte is treated with the same consideration given to George and Louis. I'm asking you to be her grandfather first and Camilla's husband second, at least when her well-being is at stake." The request was simple in its language but complex in its implications. Charles would need to confront Camilla about her decisions, potentially causing strain in his marriage and undermining the united front they had worked to establish since his coronation. But the alternative was allowing his granddaughter to be systematically excluded from the very experiences that would prepare her for her future role within the monarchy. Charles returned to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly, looking every one of his 75 years. The weight of kingship had always been substantial, but the burden of balancing personal relationships with royal responsibilities seemed to be taking an increasingly heavy toll. He picked up William's proposal and read it carefully, his expression revealing the internal struggle between his roles as king, husband, and grandfather. "I need time to consider this," Charles said finally. "These are complex matters that affect not just our family, but the stability and public perception of the monarchy itself. I cannot make hasty decisions based on emotional responses, regardless of how strongly I might feel about the people involved." William felt a flash of disappointment at his father's non-committal response, but he also recognized the political reality that Charles faced. As king, every decision carried weight beyond its immediate family implications, and the public scrutiny of royal family dynamics meant that internal conflicts could quickly become external crises if not handled with extreme care. "How much time?" William asked, knowing that delays could be used to avoid difficult decisions indefinitely. "Give me 48 hours, Charles replied. "I'll speak with Camilla about your concerns and try to find a solution that addresses Charlotte's needs while maintaining family unity." But, I want your assurance that this conversation will remain private until I've had a chance to resolve the situation internally. The request for secrecy was reasonable but also concerning, as it suggested that Charles was more worried about public perception than about the actual harm being done to Charlotte. William nodded his agreement, though he silently resolved that his patience would have limits if no meaningful action was taken within the specified timeframe. As William prepared to leave, Charles stood and moved around the desk to place a hand on his son's shoulder. William, I want you to know that I love Charlotte deeply, and I would never knowingly allow her to be harmed or marginalized. But, I also need you to understand that leading this family, especially in these challenging times, requires delicate balancing of many competing interests. The words carried both affection and frustration, revealing a man caught between personal feelings and political necessities. William nodded his understanding, though he remained unconvinced that his father would ultimately choose Charlotte's interests over marital harmony when forced to make that choice. Walking back to his car, William felt the weight of uncertainty settling over him like a heavy cloak. The next 48 hours would determine not just Charlotte's immediate future, but the long-term dynamics of their family relationships. He had done everything possible to present a reasonable case for protecting his daughter's interests, but the ultimate decision now rested with a man torn between competing loyalties and impossible choices. The 48 hours stretched like an eternity for William and Catherine, each passing moment bringing them closer to a confrontation that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of their daughter's life and the dynamics of the royal family itself. William found himself unable to concentrate on his official duties, his mind constantly returning to the conversation with his father and the uncertain outcome that awaited them all. Catherine, meanwhile, struggled with the impossible task of maintaining normalcy for the children while preparing for the possibility that their carefully constructed family life might soon be disrupted by forces beyond their control. Charlotte, blissfully unaware of the political machinations swirling around her, continued her usual routine of lessons, playtime, and family dinners. She spoke excitedly about the upcoming state dinner, describing in detail how she planned to curtsy to the visiting Danish crown princess and practice her Danish phrases that she had been learning from her language tutor. Each innocent comment about her anticipated participation in royal events felt like a small knife twisting in William's heart, knowing that her excitement might soon turn to confusion and disappointment. On the morning of the second day, Sir Edward Thompson called with news that sent ice through William's veins. Charles had requested an emergency family meeting at Clarence House, with attendance required from William, Catherine, Harry, who was flying in from California, and Camilla herself. The formal tone of the summons suggested that significant decisions had been made, though the direction of those decisions remained ominously unclear. The drive to Clarence House felt like a journey toward an inevitable collision, with William gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary while Catherine sat in contemplative silence beside him. They had discussed various scenarios and potential outcomes during their sleepless nights, but both recognized that they were approaching a moment that could redefine their relationship with the royal family and Charles himself. The weight of Charlotte's future pressed down on them like a physical force, making even routine conversation feel impossible. Clarence House buzzed with unusual activity as they arrived, palace staff moving with the efficient urgency that typically accompanied significant royal announcements or crisis management situations. Sir Edward met them at the entrance, his usually impeccable composure showing subtle signs of strain around his eyes and the tight line of his mouth. He guided them through familiar corridors that somehow felt different, charged with the electricity of impending confrontation. Harry was already seated in the family drawing room when they arrived, his casual California attire contrasting sharply with the formal atmosphere of the royal residence. His presence added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation, as his well-documented criticisms of Camilla and the royal system could either provide valuable support for William's position or escalate the conflict beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The brothers exchanged meaningful glances, years of shared experience allowing them to communicate without words about the gravity of the situation they faced. Camilla entered the room with regal bearing, her perfectly styled hair and immaculate clothing projecting an image of unshakable confidence and royal authority. But William noticed subtle signs of tension in her posture, the slight stiffness in her smile, and the way her hands clasped her handbag perhaps a bit too tightly. She took her seat with practiced grace, but her eyes carried a wariness that suggested she understood the stakes involved in this family gathering. Charles appeared last, his expression grave and his movement deliberate as he surveyed the assembled family members. The weight of kingship seemed particularly heavy on his shoulders that morning, emphasized by the formal clothing and ceremonial decorations that reminded everyone of his ultimate authority within the family hierarchy. He carried a leather folder similar to the one William had brought to their previous meeting, suggesting that official decisions had indeed been made and were about to be announced. Thank you all for coming on such short notice, Charles began, his voice carrying the measured tone of official pronouncements rather than the warmth typically associated with family gatherings. The matters we need to discuss affect not only our personal relationships but the future stability and public perception of the monarchy itself. The formal language created an atmosphere of legal proceeding rather than family conversation, immediately putting everyone on edge and suggesting that compromises might be difficult to achieve. William felt Catherine's hand brush against his in a gesture of solidarity and support, while Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly preparing for the kind of institutional protection of harmful behavior that had driven him away from royal life in the first place. Charles opened his folder and withdrew several documents, spreading them across the coffee table like evidence in a courtroom proceeding. I've spent considerable time reviewing the concerns raised about Charlotte's participation in royal events and her educational development. I've also consulted with constitutional experts and palace officials to understand the broader implications of our family decisions. The mention of constitutional experts suggested that this situation had escalated far beyond a simple family disagreement into something that could affect the monarchy's legal and traditional foundations. William felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, wondering if his efforts to protect Charlotte had inadvertently triggered a crisis that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. After careful consideration, Charles continued, his eyes moving between William and Camilla, I have decided that Charlotte's original inclusion in the state dinner and other royal events should be maintained. Her education schedule will also continue as originally planned, with full preparation for her future royal responsibilities. The words hit William like a physical wave of relief, though he noticed Camilla's face tighten almost imperceptibly at the announcement. Charles had chosen to support Charlotte's interests, but the cost of that decision was clearly visible in his wife's carefully controlled reaction. The victory felt bittersweet, knowing that it had come at the expense of Charles's marital harmony and Camilla's authority within the family structure. However, Charles added, his tone becoming even more serious, this decision comes with conditions that all parties must understand and accept. The qualification sent a chill through the room, suggesting that William's victory might come with prices he hadn't anticipated or considered. Catherine's hand found his again, this time gripping tightly as they both braced themselves for whatever conditions their success would require them to accept. Going forward, all decisions regarding the children's participation in royal events and their educational development will be made collectively, with input from both sets of parents and final approval from myself as head of the family, Charles announced. This will prevent future misunderstandings and ensure that everyone's concerns are heard and considered before changes are implemented. The solution was diplomatically elegant but practically concerning, as it essentially gave Camilla veto power over future decisions regarding Charlotte's development and participation in royal life. While it protected Charlotte's immediate interests, it also ensured that future conflicts would be inevitable as differing philosophies about her role and education continued to clash within the family structure. Camilla spoke for the first time since the meeting began, her voice carefully modulated but carrying an undertone of steel that everyone in the room recognized. I want to be clear that my concerns about Charlotte were never personal. They stemmed from my desire to protect her from the pressures and scrutiny that can be overwhelming for children in the public eye. However, I accept His Majesty's decision and will support Charlotte's full participation in family events going forward. The statement was gracious on its surface but carried implications that suggested future resistance might take more subtle forms. William recognized the diplomatic language of strategic retreat rather than genuine acceptance, and he suspected that this resolution would be temporary rather than permanent. The underlying conflicts about Charlotte's role and importance within the family had not been addressed, merely papered over with procedural solutions that could easily be undermined or circumvented. Harry, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke up with characteristic bluntness. This is exactly the kind of institutional protection of harmful behavior that drove Meghan and me away from royal life. You're treating an 8-year-old child like a political chess piece instead of addressing the real problem, which is an adult woman who sees children as threats to her position. The accusation hung in the air like an explosive device, its implications reverberating through the formal atmosphere of the royal drawing room. Charles's face darkened with displeasure at his younger son's direct challenge to the carefully crafted diplomatic solution, while Camilla's composure finally cracked slightly, revealing flashes of anger and resentment beneath her polished exterior. Harry, that's enough, Charles said sharply, his voice carrying the full authority of royal displeasure. These matters require delicate handling and mature consideration, not inflammatory accusations that serve no constructive purpose. But Harry was beyond diplomatic restraint, his protective instincts for his niece overriding his deference to royal protocol. Charlotte deserves better than to be caught in the middle of adult power struggles. She deserves to grow up knowing that her family will protect her unconditionally, not sacrifice her well-being for political convenience. The confrontation between father and son threatened to derail the entire meeting, potentially undoing whatever fragile agreements had been reached regarding Charlotte's immediate situation. William found himself in the uncomfortable position of agreeing with Harry's assessment while recognizing that further escalation could jeopardize the limited victory they had achieved for Charlotte's participation in upcoming events. Catherine intervened with characteristic grace, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the entire room. "We all love Charlotte and want what's best for her future. Perhaps we can agree to focus on that common ground while working through our different perspectives about how to achieve those shared goals." Her diplomatic intervention provided an opportunity for everyone to step back from the brink of open warfare, though the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Charles seized the moment to conclude the meeting before further damage could be done to family relationships or the carefully constructed compromise he had worked to establish. "I believe we've accomplished what we can today," Charles announced, gathering the documents spread across the coffee table. "Charlotte's immediate participation in royal events is confirmed, and we have a framework for making future decisions collaboratively. I trust that everyone will honor both the spirit and the letter of these agreements." As the family members began to disperse, William felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension about what they had achieved. Charlotte's immediate crisis had been resolved, but the deeper issues that had created this conflict remained largely unaddressed. The systematic nature of Camilla's initial campaign suggested that future challenges were inevitable, and the compromise solution provided only temporary protection rather than lasting security. Walking back to their car with Catherine, William realized that they had won an important battle but that the larger war for Charlotte's place within the royal family was far from over. The next few months would test everyone's commitment to the agreements reached in that formal drawing room, and William was already preparing for the probability that more difficult confrontations lay ahead. Charlotte was waiting for them when they returned to Kensington Palace, her face bright with excitement about the state dinner and her planned interactions with the visiting Danish royalty. Looking at her innocent enthusiasm and obvious capabilities, William renewed his silent vow to protect her from the adult machinations that had nearly derailed her royal development. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would ensure that his daughter's potential would never again be sacrificed to political convenience or personal jealousies within the royal family.